Hello and welcome into another episode of Six Rotations. I'm Daniel Gilman. He's Mick Haley. And as always, we're brought to you by SNA Sports, better equipment for a better game. And Mick, down goes number one. Texas finally falls. It was a road match, middle of the week in Ames, and Iowa State comes out victorious in a ferocious five-setter with phenomenal serving. Pepperdine loses to Gonzaga. Washington falls to Arizona State. Florida down by Georgia. Once again, another weekend with madness from top to bottom. We have maybe a front runner in the Pac-12 along with the Big West. And once again, Nebraska reigning high. And we could start with them. Nebraska, the Huskers, as we look at it now, right off the top, Mick. Number one, we didn't want to waste any time. Here's your top 10 and Nebraska taking the top spot. What do you think, Mick, about Texas's slide to 2? Maybe San Diego not getting a lot of love despite sweeping BYU.
This might have been a loss that allows Texas to win. They don't seem to do well with pressure being out in front and leading the pack, but as a team behind trying to catch up, they're really, really dangerous. This may change their whole mental approach. This may be the best thing that ever happened to Texas and the worst thing that happened to the other teams in that Final Four. So I think it's okay that Texas is second. It's interesting that the coaches went with Nebraska because it gets down to the end of October and they get a little tired and just want to put down who they think are the best teams, not who's playing the best, maybe. So look at that top four, and it's pretty interesting. And Louisville got penalized a lot for losing without DeBeer. DeBeer scores 7-6 points a set for them. In many cases, they don't have her. They're not going to win too much against top flight teams. And then Pittsburgh doesn't get any love for the win. But they penalized Louisville for the loss. So it's a strange poll the way I see it.
Yeah, not a lot of love either for Stanford, despite running through the California LA schools in UCLA and USC in 6 sets. Pitt behind Bizzario's big swings at the end of the 5th set on Sunday on ESPNU. They toppled Louisville. It was what is now 13 straight wins for the Panthers and Dan Fisher. They had that early loss against San Diego. Since then, all things clicking, including Mick, 4 straight against top 10 foes. But more about this Texas matchup with Iowa State. Now, the Longhorns bounced back to sweep West Virginia over the weekend. Iowa State with their second ever win against a top school, number 1 in the nation. They beat Nebraska back in 2012. And ready for this one. You may want to give your typical disrespect to Nebraska. I'm telling you, they deserve this one spot. They have lost less sets now than Texas. And that was the big talking point back in August, wasn't it? How many sets will Texas lose? Well, Nebraska sweeps Purdue in West Lafayette. And get this quote, okay? So Eva Hudson, right? Obviously, top pick for Big Ten, rookie of the month, rookie of the week, all of that, potentially freshman of the year as well. But John Cook, as he loves to stay in the headlines, quote goes, Becca Alec may have something to say about the obvious pick for the Freshman of the Year award. And I loved it. I love it because she outplayed Hudson. Nebraska smashed Purdue and then swept Illinois. And here they sit back in their deserved number 1 spot, as many of Big Red Nation will tell you.
Yeah, and one of our shows, we're going to have to talk about these top freshmen around the country because this is a year for freshmen. And boy, there are some good ones out there, and they are leading the way. So you just mentioned 2, but there's a whole handful. So this is going to be a big race.
And the nation watching that Iowa State-Texas match Wednesday, they saw one of the best freshmen in the Big 12, and that's Maya Duckworth. She's only 6 foot. She wasn't highly recruited. She came from Texas and was snagged up by Iowa State. And she put up huge numbers with a couple aces and 10 or more kills in both matches. And I was able to watch her on Wednesday. I was on the call for the ESPN Plus match between Texas Tech and Iowa State. Duckworth smashed the Red Raiders, and they'll take on your Longhorns here on Wednesday. We've got a great Wednesday in store. I know I don't want to jump ahead too much, but how about a preview for a national championship? Is that something that you fans may be interested in? Wednesday night, 9 o'clock Eastern, Wisconsin hosting Nebraska. Woo! Those Badgers are just hanging around, Mick, sitting at 5. I'm a little surprised that Louisville stayed above them, to be honest.
Well, I am too, but everybody's waiting for Wisconsin to beat somebody, and I mean, seriously, Wisconsin has talent, they have fans, they have the whole thing going for them, and yet they seem to kind of peter out a little bit in these big matches. They've got two this weekend. Not only do they get Nebraska, but they get Minnesota, and you can say what you want about Minnesota, but with that talent, you go out there, you know you're going to have a match of your life to win, and two wins this weekend would really propel Wisconsin into that top four, wouldn't you think?
Yes, I think it would propel them into the top three. I'm not sure San Diego's really getting the coach love that I think, and I think a lot of the West Coast thinks they deserve, because once upon a time, San Diego beat Pittsburgh and they swept Ohio State, and their only loss this season came against the Louisville Cardinals. So let's talk about the West Coast now, Mick, before we transition over to the Southeast Conference. Where are your alliances sitting in this top 10? USD, who have now swept through everybody since beating Pepperdine. They have smothered BYU. They're at 3, but in our books, the best of the West, Stanford, who just swept USC and UCLA. And then is there anyone that sits third? It's like Oregon, BYU, Washington, all smushed together.
Yeah, I have a feel that if Stanford plays, you're really concerned about them, that they're going to be a whole handful. And I watch USD, and as much as I like them, and I really think they had the best September in the world. And I made this point to you, and you pointed out that they haven't lost a set. They've been going.
Yeah, Mick comes on. He says before we start recording, he's like, "Well, they haven't looked great recently." And I went and checked, and I said, "Mick, they haven't lost a set." So this is where we have to grab that double standard, because we gave all the love the past decade to BYU, at least the past 5 years. They earned their way to hosting a regional 2.5, 3 years ago. I think if San Diego doesn't lose, you have to give them a top 4 seed.
If they don't lose, you probably have to give them that consideration. But like we said, if Wisconsin wins 2 this weekend, DeBeer comes back for Louisville, Pittsburgh keeps getting better. I mean, it's going to be a cramped top 4, in my opinion.
And you can't count out Ohio State if they go on a run late.
And if Stanford keeps getting better, I mean, you got to throw Stanford in there because of their talent. I mean, if you look across the net, you're darn worried. I don't know why they haven't been better, but I thought they dismantled USC this weekend, and USC has been coming on. The coaches showed them some love, put them on the pole, which I think is where they should be. They're playing that well, but they could not handle Stanford at Stanford this weekend.
Well, go figure, right? All of our clamoring that USC deserved the top 25 nod, and all it takes is them losing and dropping out of the top spot of the Pac-12 for the coaches to give them love. Well, I'm going to start another one. How is Iowa State not even close to being ranked? That's something that I don't understand. They do have 2 tough Big 12 losses in TCU and Kansas State, but Mick, they're the only team in the nation to beat Baylor and Texas, and they beat Texas. That in itself has me considering UCF, Houston, maybe even Kentucky falling out of the top 25 in order for Iowa State to replace them. We'll talk about the receiving votes teams in a second, but let's talk about Kentucky. Swept by Texas A&M. They did bounce back to beat them in 4 on Sunday. The SEC, Mick, is in a ton of trouble. Florida swept by Georgia in the middle of the week. Then Alabama almost beat Georgia, and Georgia won by 5. That would have been a tough loss for Florida and Georgia. Auburn, of course, lost that match against Missouri last weekend. Is the SEC a 2-bid conference?
Maybe a 2-bid conference. And I'm telling you, the middle of the pack, it's like, conferences every year, they get new players in and they redevelop their teams. And this is the hardest thing to watch. SEC is now a middle of the conference development conference. They've got a lot of teams that are okay, but nobody really stepping up and being able to control. Arkansas has tried to put their head in there several times and only to falter afterwards. The Mississippi schools last year and this year looked like they were going to do something, and then they faltered. Georgia, you thought was really going to come on and challenge the top. They didn't do very well to start with, and now they're hot. So I think the SEC is in trouble. Yes, I think that's right. I think the Pac-12 is in trouble too.
Well, let's take a look at the rest of the top 25. With Florida 14, they're the best team in the SEC according to the coaches, and then Kentucky at 20. The receiving votes have Pepperdine 26. They fell out of the poll. Arkansas 27, Iowa State 28. So I will say, according to the RPI, Arkansas puts themselves in a spot, Mick, where they need to just beat who they're supposed to beat here in the end of October, beginning of November. Because if you don't remember, the Razorbacks beat Washington and Georgia Tech in pre-conference play. They were just one loss until they hit the LSU match on opening day in the SEC. They lost there in 5. But Arkansas has the chance in Gainesville this weekend with 2. And at the moment, Arkansas's RPI is 23. Florida and Kentucky at 12 and 13. The Kentucky RPI really fell, losing to Texas A&M. But what it does is everything swings, because all those teams that lost to Texas A&M, a la Hawaii, now bump up a little bit, and everything gets into some fun stuff. Looking now at the rest of the top 25, Mick, you mentioned to me before we recorded that October is the toughest month for young teams. And of course, Florida is one of those young teams with a freshman setter in Stuckey. Purdue at 12, a young team going through trials and tribulations. Who stands out to you in the teams?
Well, I would tell you from a coaching standpoint that October is the hardest month for collegiate coaches and their players. Not only does the travel start to wear them down, the midterm exams. Some schools have 3 major exams during the year, 2 of them coming the start of October and the end of October. You're traveling during that time, you're studying, you're basically not doing anything. If you're trying to have a social life during that time, you're really stretching it, or you're awfully good in school. And so coaches, on the other hand, have to try to balance all of this. How much do they practice? How much do they give the players off to recover? It is the hardest month for players and coaches in all volleyball situations that I've run into. November is like a breath of fresh air because you know where you're going. You're sprinting, trying to get to the end of November and get that bid and then play for the championships. So if we can get through October, and boy, some of these teams are not, they have to regroup for November and come on with a new surge and some fresh air pumped into them. I was going to throw one at you though, that your team Florida is kind of in a situation where they're just sitting there and they're getting passed by. First of all, they're a highly talented team. They have some really good freshmen, good sophomore. It's a young team with a lot of talent. But they're just beating SEC teams that we just commented on that are kind of trying to get to the middle of the pack and make a surge forward. And they're not going to play anybody else. They may be one of the teams that's ranked either too high or being overlooked, one of the two. And you just can't tell unless they lose again. They can't afford to lose these teams.
Well, let's not forget, Mick, that Florida took Stanford to 5 and then stunned Wisconsin in Madison. So
well,
those
I think
are 2 wins that you could hold.
Yeah, they're living
there.
on September. I agree. They're living on September, but this is October. And that's why I was a little concerned about University of San Diego, because USD, because they don't have backups to come in and rest their players. And I just look at them and they're playing well, they're executing well, but they need this surge in November to get ready for the tournament. And I'm wondering if their conditioning and everything is good enough that they can handle this. Now, they certainly have shown it in October, right? You pointed that out. They haven't even lost sets. So they're not giving people a chance, but you've got to be, and that means they're not playing 5-game matches. So that's good. But on the other hand, now in November, they really have to be careful, and they have to watch their practice routines, and they have to really make sure that their physical abilities are good.
Well, taking a look at some of these other teams in the teens, of course, a team like Washington, they lost Maddie Ensley. She's out for the rest of the season. Then they lost to Arizona State. Big matchup coming up this weekend as Washington will host Stanford. And that should be a good telltale sign of Keegan Cook and maybe what he can pull out of a hat in terms of maybe a rabbit, maybe a tree facing the Cardinal. How about Oregon State upsetting Colorado? The Pac-12 had a wonky weekend. Houston came back to beat Wichita State in 5, and that is massive because right now Houston and UCF both top 20 in RPI, and the 2 of them already had their big clash. That could be two teams that you can just post them in unless they have a huge upset that they're going to be into the tournament.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting because now the fight is not just for the top 25, but it's the top 32,
Yeah, I was
right?
gonna say the top 16 if they want to
Yeah,
host.
and not only top 16, you're exactly right. And of course, top four for regionals and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of things to fight for here. And I'm wondering if the coaches are breaking this down to just trying to win the conference or trying to do some other things. How are they focusing, short term? Because what you want to do is you want to break your season into short periods and get the focus right now today on this and not worry about the end result and just keep going like that. So it'd be real interesting to me to hear what the coaches are doing with their teams.
It's also important to remember that we're going to get another NCAA volleyball committee top 10 coming up soon here in about a week and a half, depending on when you're listening to this. So next episode will be a little bit more of a deep dive into the playoff picture, the tournament picture. But remember, these coaches, they don't really hold that much weight. It's the RPI. You can go check that out on ncaaStats.figstats.net for the live unofficial, or on ncaa.com. They post the weekly RPIs. And let's talk, Mick, about the upcoming matches. And of course, the big ones this weekend. And they're all kind of sitting in the same spot in our AVCA poll, because looking at 9, 10, and 11, Minnesota, Georgia Tech, Penn State, Georgia Tech just staying pat. They've lost to the two big dogs in the ACC in Louisville and Pittsburgh. They're going to keep coasting until they've got another matchup with them. We'll talk about them in a second. But Minnesota and Penn State. Penn State survives Maryland in 4, a Maryland team that just keeps on blocking. They had 15 blocks in that match in College Park. And then Minnesota beating Purdue in 4, closing out the first set on a 10-3 run, really showing that Minnesota is primed for a matchup. It's Ohio State, Penn State, and Minnesota, Wisconsin on Saturday. Who are you giving the edges to?
Well, that's a tough one. I just think Minnesota will come back. Now they have let me down year after year here, and for me to throw a flag out here for Minnesota is real hard. But I just think with that talent, they're gonna get it together and get focused again and start coming after people. So I like Minnesota against Wisconsin, but if Wisconsin gets hot and they get in a good rhythm against Nebraska, whether they win or lose, they'll be hard to handle on the Saturday match. I kind of like OSU. Really, I just think they're focused now. She has them right where she wants them. I think they're gonna cruise here. Arkansas and Florida is interesting to me because this is Arkansas's chance to really do something. They're playing Wednesday and Saturday, and so that's what I'm talking about. We talked about the SC maybe being a 2-team, 3-team conference into the tournament, but ACC might be a 3-team conference.
Well, you know what? And I want to go back on that in a minute. But first off, Arkansas plays Florida Saturday and Sunday. And then Auburn and Kentucky will battle this weekend as well. So those are ones to keep eyes on. But as we look at the RPI, the SEC quietly has 5 teams in the top 30 with LSU, Mississippi State, Arkansas, and then Florida and Kentucky. So if those teams can stay winning, it'll possibly bring in the same question we had last year with, hey, the Big 12 has these 7 teams, all highly ranked in the RPI. Are they all really deserving of making the tournament? And that's a question that has to be asked. You talk about the ACC, and aside from Georgia Tech, with those two main two-headed monster at the top, there's nobody. Maybe Florida State sits there in the mid-30s of RPI, but they've got to get a big win late.
Yeah, somebody's got to break out. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. You survive October, then you break out in November, and then you get ready for the tournament. So I think these matches are interesting. I don't want to be coaching in them. I'll tell you how hard it is to get everybody motivated and focused and ready to go because they just want the tournament to get there. But boy, oh boy, they're fun to watch to see how the coaches handle this and how the players respond.
And then we've got a good Wednesday slate before the national championship rematch. Texas against Texas Tech at 8 o'clock Eastern time. That's around the same time. Florida Auburn on Wednesday is one that you were kind of referring to. And then, of course, Baylor and Kansas in action. Kansas sitting at 21 RPI. That's another one to keep an eye on. Baylor's got the 20 RPI. And Ohio State, Michigan, the game here in volleyball on ESPNU Wednesday night. Michigan lost to Indiana. They're in a must-win situation here on Wednesday.
Yeah, and the other thing we should point out is that in the SEC, everybody has 1 week where they play 3 matches. You remember LSU got caught with this where they played Kentucky Saturday and Sunday. They beat Kentucky Saturday night, then they lost Sunday, but on Wednesday,
I think they had Arkansas or something.
Yeah, they also had Arkansas and they won that match. So LSU was hot for a short time there. Now Florida's got this situation. They're playing Wednesday night, they're playing Saturday and Sunday. So it's a little bit of a challenge to see what they do with that.
Should be a great test. Of course, the big upset of the weekend, 270, the RPI beating 27 in Gonzaga, and the reverse sweep over Pepperdine. That was wild. Pepperdine will take on BYU and San Diego at home at the end of November to try to put themselves back in the national picture.
Well, that's the only way they're going to get back too, because they just lost focus. They let that happen and they lost focus. And now coaches got to get them refocused and get them back.
Yeah, they need that one. And aside from that, Mick, coming into this week, the big news, of course, the big matchup, Nebraska, Wisconsin in Madison, 9 o'clock on Big Ten Network on Wednesday. Let's sign us off with your final opinion, your thoughts. I'm going to go back and say, I think Penn State takes care of Ohio State in 5 on Saturday because it's in Rec Hall. That's just one of the bold predictions. Penn State does have a match on Wednesday, though, in Illinois. So that's one of those tough turnarounds. Nebraska at Wisconsin. Nebraska in 4. That's my guess.
Yeah, I think Nebraska thrives on this. I think they go to Wisconsin with the idea that we've got our 7,000 fans at home. We'll bring a bunch with us, but there are not enough seats, so they'll probably have to stand outside and watch them on the big picture. But I think Nebraska is playing well. I think Nebraska is deep. That's what scares me about Nebraska. I think not only has he found a starting lineup, he's found a way to use his setters. He's found something that's comfortable for the group. Now he's letting them play, and they're just beating on people. So I would say Nebraska in 4 is very possible.
Yep, and then Nebraska upcoming this weekend will have a Sunday match, I believe. Does Nebraska have Saturday? Excuse me. That's the following weekend. This weekend for Nebraska, I'm all lost here, will take on Maryland at home on Saturday night. And so the Terps, they've been frisky. They swept Purdue. They took Penn State to 4. We'll keep tabs on the 2 matches, 2 very big matches for both Wisconsin and Nebraska coming up into the committee's top 10 next week. We'll try to get a good guest on as well for our next weekend, but we'll guarantee one for middle of November when things really get going. And Mick, our last 2 guests, they put up big showings recently. Gabby Blossom with the huge sweep over BYU. And of course, Logan Eggleston breaks the ace record a few weeks ago. And she just couldn't do enough against Iowa State to stay undefeated. But your words to God's ears, right? Texas loss this week maybe saves their season. We'll stay tuned to find out. Thanks so much for joining us once again. He's Mick. I'm Daniel, and this is 6 Rotations.